I saw these Warhol films in the city, and other films in the city, and I began to think about film, and I was always waiting, oh, maybe something will happen that will lead me into making films, and it happened. I don't want to get into all the details, but I remember not even knowing the difference, asking somebody, what should I get? What's the difference between 8mm and 16mm? And gradually I learned. I got a Bolex with one lens, and I had the manual for the Bolex. So I learned a lot of stuff from the manual, and then I learned some stuff about photography from either something it said in the manual or led me to look up something like depth of field and blah, blah, all of that stuff. So then I started, and I made a few things before this. An extra thing, I was still teaching literature, and this seemed like a respite. But I didn't realize that my life was going to change. And then I started to get to know some filmmakers, Ernie Gare, Kim, other people, and other films that I saw. So when I started to make these films, some of these films, originally, the early films, were like experiments. Like I never shot a lot of stuff. Even now, I can't. Sometimes I have the camera and I see something great and I think, what am I doing? Why am I doing this? So I never really filmed anything unless I had a strong feeling about it. And so, anyway, those films came out of the experimental thing, and then Ernie said, you should contact Millennium and have a screening. So I thought, wow, I had the screening, and suddenly at that screening, I felt, I'm a filmmaker. Here I am, I'm a filmmaker. And these experiment things are really films. And so I started to make films, and I already knew these people that were, there's a whole, had known Hollis very briefly when I was in college and so on, and I had gone to that camp and Ernie. But, I felt that I was starting to know either by being friends with them or just knowing about their work. And I felt, how can I'm the wrong person to be doing this. Like they're also romantic, heroic people, who had immersed in art education. And here I was, somebody with what does it make, difference did it make to have a PhD in comparative literature? I was pushed into the world of film when I wasn't really ready for it. I wasn't really right about it. Anyway, I have this book that I wrote that I'm revising right now called The Red Thread, which is about my films and my life, but it's very complicated film. But a lot of the things that led me to the films were coming out of experiments. Like, for example, with blues, I was already teaching some classes in cinema in the English department. And somebody had gotten one of the students a Bolex that was like an 8mm Bolex, but it had the same lenses as the 60mm Bolex. And I had read somewhere that if you put a lens from a 60mm camera on an 8mm camera, it would double the focal length. So I thought, well, it'd be interesting to experiment. What about if I put this really longest telephoto thing that I have and see what it's like? So I started to film something like this. I could hardly see it. It was so hugely magnified that there was nothing. And then my wife was a potter, and so we were always surrounded by bowls and ceramic sculpture. So I said, this bowl, and why don't we put the bowl over there? Let me try to do it. It was still too close. Eventually, I went up to the 3rd floor of our house and put the bowl on a hill outside the house, and then it was just perfect. I could just see it. And so there were a lot of things when I filmed it. Also, there were things about the camera. That 8mm camera was run by a motor that connected to the wall, and I don't know, it had a transformer, and it was not working quite right. And then I found that if you stepped on it, it would continue, but it was erratic. So it would, every small time, it would slow down and then go back at the regular speed. And when it slowed down, those frames would be lighter. A total unexpected accident about it. But anyway, when I started to think of myself as a filmmaker and have that film, it's really very amazing to me. As I was saying the other day, I would tell my students, because often the beginning film students didn't have any idea what they were doing. Like, they didn't know even what was in the background or where the framing was or anything. And I was saying, I had this feeling that, wait a minute, if you're going to film something and make a film, here's how you have to think about it. You have to think that you have a responsibility for it, and you're going to have it for your whole life. It's going to be representing you and your work your whole life. And so, oddly or amazingly, who would have thought that whatever it is, more than 50 years later, I'm still like seeing things in blues. I mean, it really constantly amazes me how much is there in these early films. And so a lot of the things about the book are how it is, what kind of superficial circumstances that often are mechanical or formal, like what happens if I put this lens on this camera, and they're not full of ideas. It's not that, oh, I have this idea, now how can I make a film to show people what that idea is, or to illustrate that idea? I didn't have that. A lot of the things that went into these films, and many other ones, is a kind of intuitive gesture of, just like finding framing, saying that's right, and then it turns out that it has a lot of implications, but I've never been finished. So recently, in writing this book, I had this revival of feeling about blues, and I thought of it as the beginning of my work. But then I felt also that, you know what, I'm not just an interloper into the world of film where all these other people have the perfect lives and the perfect training, but whatever it was in my life, which who could even understand how it is, but I didn't start making films as an empty tabula rasa person. I was already a person with a life, and that life went back to, really when I was a baby and when I was studying literature and playing music and all of that enters into it. So that's how it was. So it's funny because much later, well, I'll talk about it after we see this film. This print is very interesting to me because I was looking through, a lot of my films are going to this archive. So I had to look through and see what prints are good and so on. And I found this print, and it was strange because, as you'll see, it has this light flare at the beginning. And I thought, I don't remember doing that, because it has light flares at the end, which are integral, really important part of the film. And I realized that this might have been one of the very first prints of it, because it was originally filmed in 8mm, so I had to get it blown up to 16mm. And I don't know if this is the exact print that was from the 8mm original, but it would be interesting to see it that way. I have a film that I made much later called Your Television Traveler, and one of the elements in that film is of space travel. It was taken, it's NASA footage, looking out from the back of one of these rocket things, and the booster rocket is, anyway, the image is circular. The composition of that space footage is very similar to blues, in some way. I was looking at the shadow. Somehow it came forward to me, looking at it yesterday on this computer screen in that event. And I thought, because I also think of that with the camera, that a lot of my thinking has to do with what is thought. I mean, for a long time influenced by Heidegger and so on. And I was thinking, like, what is going on when you're looking at a certain thing in an image, and then you don't even necessarily turn your head, but your attention goes to a different part of the image. Or sometimes you think about the frame, and sometimes, when I say think about, you don't necessarily think in the normal way of thinking, but you notice it. Now, what does noticing mean? Everybody is walking down the street, and everybody is aware of the circumstances around it, but they're either paying attention, they're looking for somebody, they're looking for an address on a building, they're just noticing the way the light, the way the fog is. Now, what is that noticing? What does it mean to notice something? Is some kind of human activity that's, it may not be thinking, because if you ask somebody, what are you thinking about? They won't even know what, but something is happening inside of them when they look from here to there. It's kind of an important thing to me that gets more developed later on. What I noticed even more last night, that I hadn't really focused on before, is that there's a lot of people working in that factory. I mean, it's really a long train of people, but at a certain point, they start hurrying up. You could see the movements of the first groups of people coming out of the factory are going at a certain normal pace, and then at a certain point, they're almost like rushing a little bit. And I thought, because he was limited by a role, I mean, just like I was using the whole length of a 100-foot roll, and that I think that making that film, he wanted the film to end, he wanted the roll of the film to end when finally the last person had left the doorway, and the doorway was now open, so that he must have tried, and the same thing happens in another really essential film by Lumiere, of the train leaving the station, where there's a similar thing of a kind of choreography within time. And I couldn't remember, actually, here, whether I understood that the film was coming to an end, but I somehow anticipated or wished that it would end with the flares. And as you know, the flares are when you unload the film from the camera and it's in semi-darkness rather than in complete darkness, and you get that stuff, which normally people would just remove as being not part of these cross rhythms that appear in the film are musical. So rhythmic is, and I like that a lot especially in African source music, the Caribbean music and so on, is the way that the drumming in like a lot of the jazz that I like also goes back even only as a memory of the drumming in the ceremonies. Okay, so anyway, Fogland, I had this big, for a long time, this big resentment about Fogland because it was a film, Fogland, and it was like I had a big sign over here, Fogland. And I thought, wait a minute, I've made so many films after that, I know where I'd be stuck. And the thing was, it was cheaper to rent it. It was easier to describe. I mean, a lot of ways that it became known had nothing to do with what I think is the nature of the film. But then when I started to write the book and think about it more, I sort of said, wait a minute, there is something about it. That's makes it like it is. So why don't we watch that? There's an amazing thing about this print. I mean, there's something very special about it in that the opening, the way it's kind of so light, is really beautiful. I really got into the opening and the subtle changes that are happening. Except that there's one place in the film where there are these horses that pass by along the bottom, and because it's printed so late and so light, and the beginning is so perfect, you can't see the horses. And so I have some films that I realized, like Sorry, Hear Us, where there's a slash. And my last work is called Not Nut, KNOT/NOT. And I was thinking, should I have called this fog/line? But I like that ambiguity of it. I'm thinking about the line. And there are different kinds of lines. Like at the top area, above where the trees are, there's sky, and then there's clouds. And one of the things that clouds are fog. And one of the things that happens as the film goes on is that the fog lowers. So that finally there's like a line. It's not a clear line, it's a fuzzy line between the sky and the fog over there, and then the rest of the image and the ground. So there's a lot to experience. Unfortunately, one of the things that happens to film is that it's, it gets these flakes of dust and this and that artifacts that you have to kind of look past it. But if you can't look past it, it's a kind of disturbance. And actually, the digital in thought, which we'll see now, actually, Christian, who was sent by the angels somehow to help me.
I was sent from the other direction, Larry.
You were coming from it. You've gone back to the other direction. But in any case, very painstaking, not in this, but in thought, you could, in the digital realm, kind of erase each little dot and so on. So it was mostly at the beginning of the film. This one. There's something just to say about thought, as many other things, is that something that was important to me was the stillness. I mean, in these films, the camera doesn't move at all. And to some extent, also what is present in that is a kind of passivity. I mean, I had to deal with the works of other films, and you couldn't even now, but then you certainly couldn't begin to become a personal filmmaker without being aware of the power of Brackich's work, for example. And thinking of Brackich's work and how the camera is associated with him and the movements of the camera, I felt it's sort of complicated when we mention this book, but it has a certain psychological as well as aesthetic direction, is that I chose not to want to do that. And so I approached movement very in such a way that the movement itself wasn't expressive. So I made this film Doorway, which is a kind of very slow pan, and Thought is a very slow pan. So the camera is moving as well as the things within the field of vision, but it's not moving in response to my will or even to my unconscious thing. It's responding to some kind of, and even in Horizons and in Harmonica, in the subsequent films, it's filmed out of the side window of a car, so that the movement of the camera is, the movement is determined by the car movement, especially in Harmonica, it's important like that. And it's only in later films that I began to have what I thought was the nerve to move the camera again in more very active ways, but always try to do something different from dominating with the camera. But I felt that there were tremendous psychological implications. I mean, just as in blues, I was saying that there are so many things about it that are not immediately apparent, having to do with ceremony, having to do with the family, having to do with nature, and all these films. In this film called Tree of Knowledge, where there's like very, very, almost like kind of wild camera movement, or in other films where I was doing this very fast, like alternating between single frames and short bursts of filming. I was aware of having made a psychological, almost like a personality change, so that there was an element that only I would think of, is that not moving the camera, which also, of course, the biggest influence on that was Warhol. In his early, like Empire. But there was something also that I was embarrassed about. I felt it was passivity. And it had to do with my feeling about my father, that he was too passive, and that I, as a child, for a long time, I really resented it. In fact, it was only now, after he's dead, that I come to think differently of it. But it was an important thing. So I thought even these things like not wanting to do like Brad Andrew, not to do this, not to do that, in those negative things, it was also expressing something about me, like trying to make the most out of the fact that I was passive. So that the activity that those films engender is the activity of the mind of the viewer, or so let's watch Thought, which is, except for Horizon, which is much longer, different kind of film, it's sort of the last in a series of these films that are, as you see. Now we skip over many, many years, just a different phase of my work. As a teacher, I sometimes, in the advanced classes, would have a seminar in which we would work together on a project. And so these things that were, I was interested in these things that were deep in me, that I was finding in my own films. What would it be like to share something like that with other people, the students? So besides giving them an opportunity to use equipment and learn that kind of stuff, I had different projects. Two of them became films that I recognized. And one was called Natural Selection, and this film, Sorry, Hear Us. It started out that I said in each meeting, why doesn't somebody just bring up some subject that they want to deal with? That would be this kind of starting point to see if there would be something that would ignite us into a project. So one of the students had written a poem. She said, I'm going to bring in these poems and read the poem. And so she read the poem, and in some way the poem reminded me of what I was writing at her age. Going to that, I mean, it was kind of a good student poem. It wasn't the same as the great works of human poetry. And it was going in a direction that I didn't, I felt in that moment of wanting to smash through it. In other words, the way of opening up this other kind of consciousness was to first smash the normal way that people were thinking about thinking, partly influenced by Nietzsche. So anyway, I suggested, how can we break this? How can we get back at it? And the idea came to me to see what happens if we film her and then we run it backwards. So we're hearing the words not as she was meaning them in the poem, but as something that was parallel, equivalent to those words, but having a completely different sounds and so on. So then the project was to listen to those sounds over and over again until they started to sound like other words. So that there's a kind of transformation of the poetry reading into another verbal thing. that was created by the sound of the words going backwards. Then I thought of what images do those new words suggest? So that led people to ideas of what they would film in relation to each of those words. And that again set up another thing about now thinking about those images, what sound does that suggest? So each time they thought of an association and then they filmed it, or thought of the sound, recorded the sound, and so on. So the film has to do with transformations, and equivalence and difference, and all kinds of ways, including between visual things and sound things, between sound things and when sound becomes language, etc.